Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going over Realpolitik and the nation state. And we'll be looking at the years from 1848 to 1871. Our focus will be how did the application of Realpolitik by leaders like Napoleon III, Cavour, and Bismarck shape the national boundaries and political ideologies of the 19th century. So grab a pen and paper, a tablet, and a keyboard, and we'll get going. Okay, well, the first thing that I want to talk about is the evolution of conservatism. Now, coming out of the French Revolution, there were certain characteristics that united conservatives. For the most part, they tended to be reactionary, meaning that they were, in many ways, relics of the 18th century. They looked back to the period before the Revolution. In Vienna, they had tried their best to restore things, keep the social structures of the early modern period, tried to keep social hierarchies, supported the traditional churches, and they had done their best to suppress nationalist, socialist, or liberal movements. Another characteristic of these conservatives in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars was a wariness of conflict. They had seen that war and revolution, or war tended to produce revolution, I guess I should say, right? When things get out of control, the forces of anarchy emerge, and they were very much against this. They wanted to try to manage things through the Congress system. They wanted to try to cooperate to the degree that they could, and basically keep stability in Europe. They saw that as their best chance of survival. And so to this end, they had established at the Congress of Vienna, they had established the Congress system. This was a system that prioritized diplomacy and order. It sought to maintain a balance of power, right? So they were going to cooperate and agree not to, to try to maintain equal status and power. And to this end, they had redrawn maps in order to give weaker countries more power. And they had done their best to avoid unilateral action. In other words, acting by yourself. Try to get consensus among the other members before you do anything. 1848 had really shaken up this system, though. Now, to be fair, for the most part, conservatives had won, right? So in Austria, the Viennese students were suppressed. In Germany, the old monarchs had maintained their hold on their states. I mean, you could, even in France, you could say, yeah, well, it was successful to get rid of the king, but even there was a pretty conservative government that emerged out of it. Yet 1848 really scared conservatives. Many of them began to realize the futility of resisting change. And they had, these forces of liberalism or socialism or nationalism, they recognized these were here to stay now. But they also, there was a little bit of optimism too, because they had shown that revolutionary forces could be co-opted if one was savvy enough. Many conservatives had recognized that liberals, much like themselves, wanted stability. They were middle class. They were propertied, and many of these middle-class people simply wanted a good economy, and they didn't like chaos and turmoil either. Conservatives had also recognized that, well, nationalism, if properly harnessed, wasn't necessarily something you needed to fear, but could actually be powerful and useful if channeled in the right directions. Conservatives also recognized that even working class people might be able to be appeased if if certain of their demands were met. Finally, France had proved that democracy wasn't necessarily a recipe for bringing Karl Marx into government. As you may recall from the last lecture, France had a democratic election, and it was actually fairly center-right. And so in the wake of 1848, many conservatives began to change their approach toward social change and began to seek to harness some of these new movements. 1848 also swept away some of the older conservative leaders. These were people who had lived through the Napoleonic Wars and then the French Revolution. Many of these leaders, like I said, were very averse to conflict, very averse to change. But a new and young generation of leaders began to emerge. These were people who hadn't experienced the horrors of war firsthand. These are people like Louis Napoleon to the far left, Cavour from Italy in the center, and Otto von Bismarck to the right. And these were people who were much less risk averse and open to using war as a tool for their own political ends. They weren't automatically opposed to it like earlier conservative leaders had been. These individuals came to be referred to as Realpolitikers, which is a German word that essentially means just kind of like what it says, real politics. All right. And these were people who, this was a philosophy, I guess I should say, that prioritized state interests over any one particular ideology. In other words, it emphasized practicality and power as an end to itself. The early 19th century, in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, was a great era of ideology, or romanticism, as it's sometimes called, where people really put their ideas and their emotional attachment to these ideas and ideological purity as an end to themselves. By the mid-19th century, though, this was breaking down. And a by any means necessary approach began to take root. In other words, people weren't as ideologically committed. Yeah, I'll borrow some socialist ideas and some liberal ideas and some conservative ideas. We'll mash them, but the number one goal is power. Now, naturally, when you have this sort of ideology guiding leaders who are also more open to war, this is going to cause a lot of tension among the great powers. All right. And, you know, the earlier era of cooperation and working together is going to start to break down as leaders start to look at politics as a zero-sum game. In other words, if you gain, I lose. You know, not that we can both gain and we can both come to an agreement, more like we need, you know, I've got to get mine, Otherwise, you'll take it. And so this is going to lead to a bunch of political alliances and realignments and even conflict as the mid-century starts to pass. Okay. Well, the first Realpolitiker that we want to look at is going to be Louis Napoleon. And I mentioned in our last lecture that he was elected as the president of France in 1848. And he was elected really mostly on name recognition. He had taken positions on a lot of different things over the years, but none of them were particularly consistent. So, you know, depending on what your ideology was, you tended to read it into him. And so he became the president, but, you know, France was going to be a republic, and the president was going to be have to abide by the Constitution. He was going to have to work with the National Assembly. And Louis Napoleon grew very frustrated with this and began to amass friends in the army, and essentially launched a coup d'etat. I know he was already the head of government, but he arranged it so that he was going to basically be able to rule. The National Assembly would still be there, but essentially it wouldn't be that important. He was going to rule as a monarch, essentially. You know, there was supposed to be term limits. He had that abolished. So essentially, he was going to be a monarch. Maybe a constitutional monarch, because the National Assembly was still going to be there, but there'd be no question who was in control. And, you know, so once this coup is launched, I believe it's in 1851 or 52, this becomes known as the Second Empire. So the Second Republic doesn't last more than 2 or 3 years, and we're now in the Second Empire as Louis Napoleon declares himself emperor. And Louis Napoleon is going to work at appealing to different segments of the population. He's going to recognize the importance of urban workers, and so he'll reach out to them, rural peasants, and all sorts of different groups. So even though he's an authoritarian, he's going to try to appeal to the broadest base that he can. He's going to recognize, because he recognizes, in many ways, like his uncle had, that it's important to be popular, even if you are going to be emperor. And so to this end, he began to work on a lot of economic and social policies. Remember, he came at a time when unemployment was high, and he starts a lot of economic reforms. He's also the beneficiary of a mid-century economic boom. So as many people know, the economy tends to fluctuate with periods of boom and bust. The late 1840s was a period of bust, but the 1850s was a period of boom. All right. And Louis Napoleon was definitely the beneficiary of these, and he also was pretty active on this front. And so he was very forward-thinking in his investment in infrastructure. So railroads, which were a relatively new technology, especially in France. He built a lot of railroads and railroad stations all across France. He was able to put large sections of the working classes to work, building these projects. There's a lot of technological developments that increase productivity. And so it was really a happy time economically the first couple of decades. And Napoleon was pretty popular with the masses who saw him as an effective leader. Um, and so on the home front, he was able to make a lot of overtures to groups that he believed that he needed, whose support he needed, right? So the working urban workers are a big part of the population, and they're on his side. Napoleon also engaged in a very activist foreign policy. So Napoleon was not shy about war and used it to great effect in certain cases anyways. And so one of his goals was to increase the prestige of France, which had been kind of not good since the defeat of Napoleon. And so under Louis Napoleon, many Frenchmen began to take pride in their country again as France began to engage in limited conflicts. And so, for instance, Louis Napoleon invaded Russia. Well, with the help of Britain, anyways. They waged war against the Tsar, which was popular back in France. People hadn't forgotten that it was the Russians that defeated them, and having a victorious Napoleon was very gratifying to a lot of people. The Tsar was not well liked, especially among liberals in France, for his interventions in Hungary. And so to have, Louis Napoleon fighting for against these conservative or autocratic czars was very gratifying. He also intervened in Italy, as we're going to see, for their national struggle, which proved to be popular. And maybe even more significantly, it's under Louis Napoleon that the Second French Empire begins to emerge around the globe. Now, in the 17th century, France had been pretty active in the Americas, particularly in areas of Canada and even in the central part of what's now the United States. They'd lost that empire in the 18th century, but in the mid-19th century, under Louis Napoleon, the French began to collect empires again. So Napoleon invaded North Africa, Algeria, setting up a colony there. Under Napoleon, the French also began to colonize parts of West Africa. And so they got a big foothold there as well, so North and West Africa. And Napoleon also began to colonize Southeast Asia, the countries that would eventually become Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And again, this was a source of national pride for the French. It was relatively low risk. Napoleon didn't have much difficulty defeating these areas. And so for French people, they could read in the paper that, France was growing, it was powerful, it was becoming more respected. Napoleon also intervened in the Levant, the area that's the Holy Land now. This was an area that had big Christian minorities, but they were under Ottoman control. The Ottomans were Muslim, and Napoleon was able to win concessions. And even though these areas would stay under Ottoman rule, Napoleon was able to win concessions for Christian minorities there. Now, again, this made him very popular with the people back home. Many of, particularly the peasants, were still very religious and Catholic and conservative. And the fact that Napoleon was fighting for Christians in the Holy Land was very gratifying for them. And so, again, we can see Napoleon, who is kind of he's an absolute monarch in many ways. Maybe not quite as absolute as, Some because he does have this parliament, but for all intent and purpose, he's a very conservative person in some ways, right? He doesn't believe in civil liberties. He doesn't believe in, the elections don't mean anything. But in other ways, he's intervening for economic growth. This was always like a liberal sort of thing, and putting workers to work. This was the socialist area, right? Active foreign policy. Well, conservatives in the post-Napoleonic age hadn't been that. But again, we can see that it's all about building up his own cult of personality to some degree. All right. And so we can see how Realpolitik works. It's not purely conservative. It borrows actually a lot from some of these other ideologies. Nationalism, obviously, it borrows from that. Some liberal ideas, some socialist ideas. It's a hodgepodge. Okay. Well, I want to turn to another Realpolitiker. And, this is the French interventions. This other Realpolitiker was Count Camillo de Cavour, and he's going to be the prime minister of Sardinia and Piedmont. Now, you may remember back several lectures ago, I mentioned that during the Congress of Vienna, the ruling powers had enlarged this Italian state, mostly to act as a bulwark, mostly to act as a stop against France from expansion to the south and east. You may also remember that I said that there was no Italy really. There was several states in Italy. Some of them were ruled by Italians. The most important ones were not, particularly Austria. Okay. Now, Cavour is the prime minister of Sardinia. He is working under a king, Victor Emmanuel. Prime minister he pretty much runs the government for Victor Emmanuel. And Cavour engages he's a pretty far-looking figure. He recognizes that Italy is economically underdeveloped. It's poor. And so he begins a policy of economic modernization. He modernizes, he brings in trains and industry. He begins to modernize the military. He's liberal in many ways. His ideologies are quite liberal, economic growth, and that sort of thing. Now, as we can see, though, Cavour is ruling a relatively small area. This area in dark blue is all that Cavour, Victor Emmanuel rules it, but he governs. This is all he governs. The rest of Italy, like I said, is just small kingdoms with big bad Austria in this kingdom of Lombardy, Venetia area in the aqua color. All right. They had tried their revolution in 1848, like other places, and it had failed. Austria had been able to reassert itself, and so had other areas. The middle, by the way, I don't know if we've mentioned this, is what are called the Papal States, and those are governed directly by the Pope himself. And so this is part of the Pope's domains. Okay. Well, anyways, Cavour isn't satisfied just ruling Sardinia and Piedmont. He has ambitions to increase the power of his monarch, his sovereign, Victor Emmanuel. He wants to make him the king of a united Italy because Cavour is a nationalist. He's a member. He identifies with the Risorgimento, this ideological movement that I mentioned last time that seeks to create a united Italy. And Cavour thinks that he can use the national sentiments of many of these Italians who also want national unification. He thinks if he can appeal to them, he might be able to pull off this very difficult task because, you know, Sardinia is small, but Austria is a major power. And so rather than just challenging Austria, which he knows he would lose, even with his military and economic reforms, he begins to work on diplomacy. One of the groups that he reaches out to are the secret societies that are found in almost all major Italian cities at this time. They go by various names, Young Italy, Carbonari, but they're secret societies. They have to be secret because it's illegal to organize and to, promote liberal ideas in Italy at this time. But these are groups who are very much committed to this goal of creating Italy. They are, willing to engage in war if they can get someone to lead them, or even sabotage or assassination if they need to. All right. And so he reaches out to these groups and he gets assurances that if something were to happen, that they would rise up, overthrow the political leaders in their respective states, and they would join him in this war for national unification. More important than even these groups, though, is his overtures toward Napoleon III in France. And Napoleon III is willing to help out for a price, of course. He didn't do anything for free. He's willing to help out for a price. He sees this as a good gamble on his part. One, it could increase his prestige. Two, he doesn't like the Austrians. The French and the Austrians haven't gotten along, and his uncle and the Austrians had a complicated relationship. And three, Napoleon thinks that if he's seen as supporting liberal and nationalist causes, that'll bolster his own support with liberals and people back home in France. And so he agrees to help out with the understanding that he's also going to get some territorial concessions out of the whole thing. And he gets a marriage out of it too. Okay, so with all of this in place, his modernized military, his economic reforms, he's got the assurances of the secret societies of Louis Napoleon, Cavour manages to goad Austria into war. And initially it goes really, really well. The Austrians are caught off guard. Louis Napoleon's troops are very effective. They swing across northern Italy. They drive the Austrians out of Lombardy, all across Italy. These secret societies, these revolutionary groups rise up. And this starts to go a little too well, at least from Napoleon's perspective. He was banking on maybe enlarging, Sardinia in northern Italy, but he soon finds there's a situation where all of Italy might become united, and this scares Napoleon a bit. He wasn't banking on that. And part of it is, well, just having a new large power to the south, but also the fact that the revolutionaries are intent on taking over all of Italy, including the Papal States. And this puts Napoleon in a very dicey situation with his Catholic constituency back home. Many Roman Catholics are very respectful and toward the Pope. The Pope is sending out letters. He's very angry about this whole situation. And Napoleon is, backs out and is actually threatening to fight Italy now to restore the Papal States. And to his credit, what Cavour does is he recognizes that without French support, he's not going to be able to successfully do this. He has nationalists who are, urging him to go for it, fight. We'll fight the Austrians, we'll fight the French, we'll fight everybody for Italy. But to his credit, being a realpolitiker, Cavour is willing to be satisfied with 90% of what he wanted rather than 100%. And so he agrees that the Pope can keep most of central Italy, or a big part of it. And he also agrees that Austria can stay in the northeast, which angers Italian nationalists, but Cavour can rest on his laurels and say that he is the one who united Italy. He has gotten his monarch, Victor Emmanuel. He's crowned the king of Italy. And he knows, and he's correct on this, that if he bides his time, he'll get the whole eventually. Although he doesn't, because he dies shortly after this. But eventually, in the next couple of decades, the Italians are able to get the area around Rome and also the northeast. All right, so a little bit of realpolitik in action in Italy. So hopefully you can see some of the patterns that emerge between these realpolitikers. Well, lastly, I want to talk about the big realpolitiker, and this is Otto von Bismarck, who maybe does it better than anybody else. Okay, so who is Otto von Bismarck? Well, he's a Prussian. Remember, Prussia is one of the two big states in this Germanic confederation. The king of Prussia is Frederick Wilhelm. And Frederick Wilhelm has a bit of an issue. And his issue is related to a promise he had made in 1848. In 1848, he had agreed to a constitution. And this constitution bound him at least a little bit. He had agreed that the Prussian parliament would be in control of state finances. In other words, they would have to vote him a budget. And this started to become an issue in the late 1850s and early 1860s because Frederick Wilhelm wanted to modernize his military. Military technology was advancing very rapidly. New guns that were capable of firing several different rounds instead of one. Larger cannons, and just a larger military. Frederick Wilhelm was part of this Prussian tradition of a powerful military, and he wanted funding to increase this project of his. Unfortunately, the Prussian parliament wasn't keen on giving him this money. They hadn't forgotten that it was the army that had suppressed the revolutions of 1848. The parliament was dominated by liberals, and many of them were resentful of that. They didn't want the army being enlarged at all. They didn't want to spend money on that. And so they refused funding. And so, as a reaction to this, Frederick Wilhelm called in Otto von Bismarck, who was a Prussian nobleman. And Bismarck had a reputation for being a hard-nosed political conservative, and he seemed like just the type of guy that might be able to break this deadlock. as prime minister. And so he called up Bismarck in 1862. And so the Prussian Diet, as it was called, Parliament, was deadlocked. Nobody could get the members to agree to this funding. And so with Bismarck there as the representative of the crown, Bismarck called the parliament together, the Diet, and he gave a famous speech called the Blood and Iron speech. And basically, he harangued them for their short-sightedness and their ineptitude. He reminded them that they wanted to see a unified Germany, but that a Germany would not be unified with words and speeches like the members of the Diet were accustomed to giving, but by blood and by iron. Well, this didn't really move the members, but Bismarck announced that he was just going to ignore them, and he was going to raise funding without them, which angered them even more. But there was really little that they could do to stop him. And so Bismarck just strong-armed the members of this Diet and managed to get his funding for the military. Now, he could have left it at that, but Bismarck was a pretty crafty manipulator himself. And he recognized that he would be able to get his way more if he could manufacture crises and use the German and Prussian national spirit to his advantage. And so, in order to achieve his goal, which, like Cavour, was to make his sovereign, his monarch, the king of a united territory, in this case Germany, he realized that he was going to have to manufacture some crises. Now, there were several hotspots around Germany at this point. And as Bismarck surveyed the landscape, he settled in on one of these. In northern Germany, it borders Denmark. And there was a bit of an issue there. And it was an issue over an area, and I'm going to butcher the name, Schleswig-Holstein. And essentially, the issue was that this was an area that was under the Danish crown, but was a German majority-speaking area. In the minds of many German patriots, whether they lived in Prussia or elsewhere in Germany, this was an unacceptable situation. Why should Germans be under Danish control? And as tensions mounted, the Danish crown, suppressed these uprisings in his territory, and this angered German patriots more. And Bismarck saw this as an opportunity to win some support for himself and his king, Frederick Wilhelm. Now, Denmark is quite a small country, especially compared to Prussia. But nonetheless, Bismarck was a very cautious person, and he began to make alliances. He made some alliances with Russia. He didn't want, to start a war in the West and then be attacked from the East. He reached out to Austria and brought them in on this project, and basically made sure that his diplomatic ducks were all in a row. And he invaded Denmark with his new army that he had gotten money for. And with the help of the Austrians and other German states, it was really not even a war, and Bismarck was able to get a success and win himself a lot of notoriety among German patriots. This, people weren't, especially in Prussia, weren't happy that he had seized funding without their permission, but hey, a win was a win. And so Bismarck used this same strategy again. Now, Bismarck's ultimate goal was to become or to have Frederick Wilhelm, his monarch, become the king of all of Germany. And so he knew that this was going to be impossible as long as Austria was in the picture. Austria would never consent to a Germany dominated by Prussia. There was already tensions between the two countries, and this was going to be a no-go for them. And so Bismarck knew that he would eventually have to fight Austria. And so much like he had done in the case of Denmark, he began to make alliances, and this was a big part of his strategy. Bismarck's real genius was in diplomacy more than anything else. His philosophy was always make sure that your enemy is isolated and that you have allies. And so there were a couple of obvious allies. One was Russia. Russia wasn't happy with Austria. They had helped them in 1848, and Austria hadn't helped them when they were invaded by France and Britain, and so they were upset about that. Another natural ally was Italy. Don't forget that piece of northern Italy that Austria is still clinging on to. And he was able to even bring France on board with this by making vague promises that he would give France some territory. And so in 1867, I believe it is, he invaded Austria. Now, a lot of people at the time thought that this was going to be a relatively quick war, and that it would be Austria that was going to easily defeat Prussia. They were much larger, and they were the senior partner. But much to everybody's shock, this is not what happened. Those railroads that Prussia had invested in meant that troops were able to quickly get to the front lines. Those guns that they had purchased meant that they could fire many shots off before the Austrians could fire. And so with speed and ferocity, Bismarck and the Prussians were able to defeat the Austrians. Now, there were many in Prussia, including Frederick Wilhelm, who urged Bismarck to finish off the Austrians, invade and seize Vienna. But Bismarck didn't want to do that. And the reason is he was already thinking a few steps ahead. He wanted to unify Germany, and his version of Germany would be a smaller version of Germany that would not include Austria. So again, he thought it was too big for both powers to be in there. And so all he wanted to do was to neutralize them. And with Austria neutralized, he was able to seize northern Germany. It was much less of a seizure as more of a voluntary joining of Prussia because, the German patriots were so stoked about what Bismarck was doing. He also knew that he was going to need Austria because his next target was going to be France, and he couldn't have a hostile Austria, and so he gave them pretty good terms. And they actually agreed to an alliance with him. And so his next move was to invade France. And again, same thing. Make assurances with the Russians, allow them to beat up on the Poles for a bit, give them something that they want. The Italians were pretty happy because they had just, cleared the Austrians out of their last territory. They were pretty satisfied. They were a little resentful toward Napoleon for backing out of their alliance. Austria was gratified that Bismarck hadn't pushed his advantage, and so Bismarck was able to manufacture a war against France, mostly by intercepting cables and editing um, editing messages that went back and forth, making it seem like Louis Napoleon had insulted the Prussian king. It was basically lying and manipulation. But he was able to goad Louis Napoleon, who wasn't averse to war himself, into a battle. And once again, people said, well, okay, defeating Denmark, of course. Austria, that was a surprise, but now you're talking France. You're talking a Napoleon. You've stepped in it this time, Bismarck. But again, to everybody's surprise, not only were the Germans able to rush troops to the front line, their guns, their weapons, French resistance crumbled. In a matter of months, the Germans were surrounding Paris. Louis Napoleon's government collapsed. He goes into exile. And the Germans are able to acquire this territory on the German-French border called Alsace and Lorraine. This is an area that was disputed between the two countries. It was German-speaking. Again, German nationalists don't like this, but it was under French control, and they were able to reunite this with Germany. With this massive win, the rest of Germany, southern Germany, Bavaria, joins into this united Germany. And in 1871, in Versailles, in the Hall of Mirrors, so this is an area that was selected for a purpose. Remember, the French had been humiliating the Germans for centuries, particularly under Napoleon. And now here they are in Versailles, the home of Louis XIV. And Bismarck chooses this as the location to announce the creation of the German Empire. Friedrich Wilhelm is brought in. All of the Prussian aristocrats are there, and they announce him as the Emperor of the German Empire. And so now Germany is united. France has been humiliated. The Second Empire has collapsed. It's now the Third Republic, if you're keeping track of these things. And people wake up in a relatively short amount of time across Europe to realize that there's a new 800-pound gorilla in the center of Europe. Germany is now the largest country in Western Europe. It has not only the largest population, but it also is technologically advanced. It's warlike. It's seemingly fairly aggressive, although Bismarck is himself is content. He doesn't want any more territories. He's achieved his objective, but Germany is going to be able to throw its power around in ways it really hasn't. The French are humiliated. They've lost territory. They've lost prestige. And there's now a new great power in the center of Europe. And that goal of the participants of the Congress of Vienna is shattered. The balance of power is disruptive. There's essentially a superpower now right in the middle there. And so we'll see how this plays out. But for right now, what I'd like you to do is to answer this question: how did the application of Realpolitik by key leaders like Louis Napoleon, Cavour, and Bismarck shape the national boundaries and political ideologies of 19th century Europe?